Welcome to the Five Phenomenon Podcast. I am your host, Shane Hayes, and coming up on today's episode, Tim Lucas, founder of Video Watchdog magazine, which is now being published online. Notable film critic and film scholar. He has written many books, fiction and both film criticism, most notably Mario Bava, All the Colors in the Dark, which is a mammoth volume. For today's episode, the interview went so long that this episode is being divided into two parts, and enlisted for this episode, I got co-host, former guest of the show, Ted Haycraft, and hopefully he'll be on a few more episodes in the future. Also, technical note, for those of you who don't want to listen to the blabber at the beginning of what I just watched this week, as I've heard it called in podcasting world, the Marin Open. I went ahead and just here for the interview. I put the timestamp in this episode's description of when the actual interview begins. So if you want to skip ahead, feel free. I don't have any advertisers right now or ever. So, but first off, what I watched this week. How was you guys this week, huh? Yeah. Earlier this week, I went to the theater to see the Way Back, the Gavin O'Connor, Ben Affleck sports movie, and. For starters, Gavin O'Connor holds us this movie embraces every single cliche, sports movie cliche, and addiction movie cliche. But damn, if Gavin O'Connor doesn't just consistently make satisfying movies, like this movie, I heard it said by someone else. This movie, the way it addresses its cliches is it just keeps walking through them with shoulders high, and there's some interesting stuff alongside, Ben Affleck drinking a 36 pack of the same beer brand throughout the entire movie. But that unfortunately is probably going to be my last theatrical screening for a while, feels like. Showplace Cinemas hasn't closed down yet, but IU Cinema and the Bell Court both shut down for at least a month. So I'm sure like the rest of you are holed up your social distancing. We're watching a lot of stuff at home. I made the mistake of following the iTunes trend and watching Steven Soderbergh's 2011 epic Contagion. And that was a mistake. Mostly because, there's been some different mortality statistics, but I think the South Korean mortality statistic for coronavirus is 0.6%, and Contagion has 30%. So after a certain point where it's neat, there's the parallels. They talk about not touching your hands, washing your hands, and social distancing, things like that, and they get across stuff like that. The movie is not going to make you feel good. It's in current times. It's not. I don't want to put out a prediction, but I don't think it's going to be that bad. I'm just making a soft prediction, just putting that out there. It was funny because at the time when Contagion came out, I was expecting this big globe-trotting epic. I saw it on an IMAX screen in Austin, and at the time I was editing for Terrence Malick on To the Wonder. And when you edit for a director, you develop a lot of their instincts, for the time. And Steven Soderbergh shoots on a lot of digital stuff. He loves the red camera, and he's shooting an IMAX level movie. He always shoots a lot of low depth of field stuff. I love it, but at the time that's not where my head was at. Terrence Malick films within every detail in the shot with a lot of wide angle lenses, and everything's very deep focused in there. And so I just remember thinking it was a cheap epic at the time. I will say the movie's better than I remember. A lot of good performances in there, but coronavirus, this is unprecedented times. This is just bizarre. It's the box office this last weekend supposedly was the lowest in 22 years. The theaters right now are committing to 50% of filling up their auditoriums. A bunch of theaters are doing, besides the ones that are closed, and who knows how long it's going to be before eventually they do close for a few days. And I've never read anything, but I'm curious if there's any studies of what happened in the Spanish flu in 1918, what movies, because obviously that was a period where features were still growing, and there's a massive upward trajectory through in the silence. But I've never heard like what happened with ticket sales then, where people. I mean, there were people that were keeping to themselves and quarantining then, right? And but it's also just. I'm fortunate as an editor. It's easy for me to work remote, although they don't typically offer it, and it's something you have to, develop with a reputation with, or a relationship with somebody. So I'm not necessarily getting a lot of gigs for that, but set people, every movie shut down. Like at this speaking, I think the only thing still going at the major studios is like Matrix 4, but they just announced yesterday the Batman shut down. That was a holdout. All these movies getting pushed back. Marvel's still sticking with Black Widow for now, but who knows how long it's going to happen. Mulan's got pushed back. This is just unprecedented. Does the economy just pause? Like, what is... It's bizarre. So... On today's episode is film critic and historian Tim Lucas, and to help me out with this episode is his friend and former guest and future co-host of the guy, Ted. The plan's always been that you're going to host a few episodes with me, so
hopefully a few or more than a few.
Tim Lucas was kind of one of the first people that wrote about when VHS was getting big. He was one of the first people that wrote about not just the movie itself, but the presentation, things like when pan and scan was still prominent, and this thing that morphed, and especially whenever the DVD boom happened. And
no, the great thing about Tim, and I think you'll hopefully, he's very articulate, and I quickly became one of my favorite writers. Danny Perry, he wrote the cult movies, and then we're currently Glenn Erickson, DVD savant, or Cine Savant, or Cine, I don't know how he has changed his name from DVD savant. But anyway, I'm rambling here, but as I usually do. But Tim is a very interesting person because he's a historian, he's a critic, he's written screenplays, he's dabbled in comic books and now even music, and he does wonderful commentaries. And so there's a lot to talk about. So we could have kept on talking all night. We did cut off after a while. I think you're going to make a two-part out of
In fact, yes. We went so long that this is now a two-part episode.
But I think when I met Shane, was I already talking about Tim when you first met me?
I can't remember.
Because I love Video Watchdog. Video Watchdog
You talked about Video Watchdog.
It was my Bible. It was, over Sight and Sound, over Film Comment, over anything that was coming out on any magazine, whatever. Video Watchdog was the magazine to have. And it was mostly genre, mostly horror and fantasy, but there would be Tate or Kozlowski in it, or
as we talk about later, he's a good bridge between high and low. But people don't make distinctions between higher and low art too.
And just to say, Quentin Tarantino puts copies of the magazine in Death Proof if you look closely on a newsstand and different places.
Yeah. So without further ado, here's Tim Lucas.
I just left the television station. I left work today, and we're doing a whole hour-long special. Telling you, I'm sure to put fear in the tri-state, here in Evansville.
Are you trying to say local news journalism is spreading fear in the wrong places?
Oh no, we never do that. But Shane, this is Shane Hazen.
No, that's the government's job.
That's true. Yeah. But yeah, this is good buddy Shane. And,
Hi, Shane.
And he's got some interesting stuff that's happened. But I met him. We were writing for the new same magazine, What Passes for an Entertainment magazine here in Evansville. We were both writing for it. And he's young. How old are you now?
38.
He's 38. So he's this little twerp that was writing, and he was writing over my head. So I was like, who is this guy? Who is this Shane Hazen? And then
you started writing at an early age too, didn't you?
I was 14. This was like 1971 or 2, I think late 71.
Was this the Cinefantastique stuff?
I started out writing for my high school newspaper.
Same here.
And then, it was when I was a freshman, I went into orientation the very first day when we went in there as junior high graduates into the high school, and there was the class president of the school, the student of the student council, president of the student council. His name was Randy Parsons. And he invited everybody to get involved in high school. He made a big pitch about everybody to get involved in whatever they were into. There was a group there that would help to foster their interests. And as he was leaving the auditorium, I ran up behind him, and he was like gaining distance down the corridor. And I said, "Mr. Parsons." And he turned around, not being accustomed to being called Mr. Parsons by anybody. And I introduced myself and told him that I was wondering if the paper, the school paper, the Mirror, needed a critic, a film critic. And he told me the next time I saw him that I could do that. And I also was like a cartoonist for the paper, and
how often did they
did
publish?
the occasional. What?
How often did they publish?
Every 2 weeks.
Okay.
As I recall, it was every 2 weeks, and I actually did a comic strip for them that lasted for a while. Unfortunately, I only have the first issue that I appeared in and the next to last issue that I appeared in. The others have all disappeared, and I've not been able to get them back. But I wrote record reviews, did movie reviews. Surprisingly, for a high school paper, I ended up covering a lot of X-rated movies, like El Topo and Clockwork Orange and The Devils.
So movies that in theory you should not be able, anyone at the school except maybe senior. Wait, X was 17, or was that?
Yeah, I think it was 17 in the state of Ohio. Yeah, so it was only the seniors that would be able to take advantage, and they may have had moral or reasons why they might not want to go, thinking that anything that was X-rated was bound to be pornographic.
Yeah. Are you're Cincinnati based?
Yes, always have been.
Okay. So what basic question I ask everybody is, what was your first movie?
My first movie?
Yeah. First movie and first theatrical experience.
Okay. Well, the first movie I ever saw, I can't be too clear on that because I was always watching television from my earliest days in the crib. It was put on to keep me quiet, the television, and I would watch things there. But the first movie that I remember seeing as a theatrical experience was a revival of The Incredible Shrinking Man. This was in the early 60s. And my grandmother took me, and I remember it as my first theatrical experience. I may have had drive-in experiences, but this was my first indoor, enclosed experience.
Do you remember the theater?
Yes, it was the Plaza Theater, where I saw virtually every movie that I saw between the ages of, say, 6 and 14, 15, It closed after that, and I left school not long after that.
How big was the theater?
It was like, I guess, your standard 400-seat neighborhood theater, something in that range. But the thing about The Incredible Shrinking Man was that I think my grandmother wanted to see the co-feature, and we got there early in order to get a seat, and we ended up seeing the end of the co-feature, which was The Incredible Shrinking Man. And we went in, and she prepared me for the experience. And I remember walking down that sloping aisle toward my seat in the dark and suddenly seeing a giant spider appear on the screen and running out screaming. And I had to be lured back in. And when I came back in and we actually got into a seat, it wasn't long before the spider came back. And so then I left the theater and refused to come back. So my grandmother did not get to see whatever it was she went to see. And the funny thing is that in the apartment that she had cockroaches, a lot of cockroaches in the basement. I remember I would turn on the light and look down there and see them scatter. So I had feelings in my mind already that were against being in basements. And when I went into the theater, that's what I saw on the screen, a big basement. And so I think somehow that subconsciously oriented me to be relating the cinematic experience to one of fear at the same time, and it's always been something I've responded to and tried to understand.
That's the birth of fear. Because one of the things I find fascinating is that when I ask people these questions, typically there's a few people that say wonderment. There's a thing of wonderment, but a lot of people my first movie memory is which, I mean, to go into the generational divide, but it was Gozer in Ghostbusters. It was that scene where the hands come out of the couch, and I kept thinking that like there was glowing eyes in the other room, and I couldn't put my hand on the couch that way. And like, I don't know that you're saying you think that specifically made you a horror film fan for life.
Well, it made, I don't know, it may run even deeper. I mean, that horror is somehow like a room tone with me. It's just like a constant room tone. And the things that attract me are things that have some sort of a fearful dimension. They're things that are powerful in some way. And that power may be expressed in the form of suspense or beauty. I remember as a child, this must have been after I saw Incredible Shrinking Man. I went with my grandmother and mother downtown to see Pinocchio when it was revived. And I remember sitting in the back row, and there are terrifying scenes in Pinocchio, but I remember also hiding my eyes sometimes when the images were just too beautiful to look at. So I had a very sensitive response to beauty and color and horror, anything like that. So it was always a very emotional experience for me to go to the movies.
What about drive-ins? Or it sounds like you said drive-ins maybe been preceded. Yes. Did you have a particular drive-in? Your mom used to take you to drive-ins?
Yes. My mother had a job that kept her busy during the weeks, and so I was usually with a foster family. She was a single mother working a job, and she would take me home on the weekends. And so seeing my mother again and getting to go home again, those feelings were both related to the ritual of going to the drive-in together. And I would be dressed when she picked me up, but she would have pajamas in the car for me. And before we went to the drive-in, we always went to this little one of two pharmacies that were near the two respective drive-ins we went to, and I would buy a stack of comic books that I could read in the back seat while we were waiting for night to fall. And I would change into my pajamas and read my comics until the movie came on. And obviously my attention was sort of divided, as it always is in the drive-in, by what's on the screen and what's happening around your car. You know, it could be people walking by, different personalities of people walking by, the action going on in the concession stand, sometimes the hilarious contrast between what's on the screen and the silhouettes of children playing on the playground underneath the screen. You know, some horrible thing could be happening up on the screen in a horror movie, and then there'd be kids playing below. So I don't have a specific, really, like a key drive-in experience.
Tim, did your mother pick the films for herself, or did she tailor them to you, or it was back and
forth?
Both.
I remember both experiences, and I remember seeing my earliest Roger Corman, Edgar Allan Poe pictures during that time. I remember seeing King Kong versus Godzilla, which had a huge promotional engine, you know, guiding it into town. I mean, they actually put little likenesses of King Kong and Godzilla on the drive-in sign outside, I remember.
Would your mom watch?
Oh, sure.
You saw your mother at a young age watching these genre films and getting a kick out of them just as much as you were.
Yeah. Right.
Was that her general taste?
My mother also had other specific interests in movies. She loved religious epics, for one thing. She loved movies about miracles. So I think that may have instilled in me some appreciation for fantasy, you know, just as a sort of bass tone for the whole thing. But she also liked sleazy movies. I have to say that she liked sleazy movies because we would often go to the drive-in, and they'd be strange movies, I know. And sometimes she would actually tell me, okay, go into the back seat and lie down. It's like when something adult was going to happen on the screen, she wanted me to get down behind the seat.
What was an example?
Hide my eyes. Well, boy, it's hard for me to figure out what these films were. I mean, sometimes I know they were European. I remember I have this very strange memory that I've never been able to trace that was of a movie ending. It was in color, and there was a man who looked like what is Horst Buchholz, the German actor Horst Buchholz. Right. He looked like that, but he was like standing in a greenhouse, what looked like to be a greenhouse, and it was raining outside. And he lifted a gun to his head and he shot himself in the temple. And that's how the movie ended. This is my memory. But I don't know if that was a dream that I had when I fell asleep at the drive-in or what, but I've never been able to trace that movie. But there were some adult-leaning films like Teenage Wolfpack that Horst Buchholz appeared in during that period. So it's quite possible I did see him in something during that time.
I just your essay on Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, you mentioned that you were 6 when you first really fell in love with movies.
I suppose so.
Okay.
It was a big year for me. It was like 1962, and that was the point when I was 6. I've not really been able to trace the time of that first experience of seeing The Incredible Shrinking Man. I've found a couple of newspaper listings for what might have been it, but I don't think it must have been earlier than when I was 6, because I remember going to movies for the first time on my own when I was 6 years old. I was living with a family that was just a short distance away from the local theater, the Plaza, as I mentioned earlier. And I was able to just walk the equivalent of like 3 blocks and be there. And in those days, the matinees were 75 cents, and there were a lot of kids lined up every weekend to see double features. And I would often, if I really liked something, I would go back and see it on Saturday and Sunday.
You mentioned Jerry Lewis in the article, or you mentioned Absent-Minded Professor specifically. I kind of wanted you and Ted to deep dive onto Jerry Lewis because I know Ted's a fan too.
Oh, well, that's the Nutty Professor. But I love the Absent-Minded Professor, too. That was a fabulous film.
Sorry.
Yeah. The funny thing about it is, that's interesting. There's not that big a difference in age between you and me, Tim, about a couple of years or so. But I didn't see the Jerry Lewis films for some reason. I think it was my dad, maybe. It wasn't only until later that I got into Jerry Lewis. And it was through Lee Martin and Lewis films. And then the Jerry, and then trying to figure out why the French love him so much. But you were probably seeing him. He was a big box office draw for the children at that time.
Right. Yeah. And actually, I've looked up newspaper clippings from that period, and there were times when he made personal appearances at Cincinnati theaters.
Oh man.
When his movies opened, they would not be the local neighborhood cinemas like I attended, but they'd be like at the downtown theaters. The first one I saw, I think, was Cinderfella. And that was at an unusual theater. It was at a place called the Camargo Theater that was in a different area of town. It's where my cousins lived. And saw them on and had a matinee together with them and saw Cinderfella. But The Nutty Professor was a huge movie for me because it was so aggressive in its use of color. There's a scene when he's supposed to come into the classroom with a hangover, and how he conveys that is that he changes the glass in his eyeglasses to red lenses. Instead of having bloodshot eyes, he has bloodshot eyeglasses, and it's a hilarious thing. And the color just becomes bombarding when he's actually having the transformation. And it was quite harrowing. I remember it cuts to a sort of overhead shot, and you see him walking around on the floor with all these chemicals from his broken lab equipment, and he's just pouring cascades of new color over and over on the floor.
When you would see something like that, now when do you think your critical facility started kicking in? I mean, that was probably more of a subconscious reaction at the time.
Right. That was all. It was all very sensory then.
Yes.
There was nothing critical about it. My critical sensibility started kicking in, I would say, around 1968 when I started buying my first books about movies. The first books I got, we found a bookstore in the Swifton Shopping Center. I forget the name of the bookstore, but they actually had a film book section. It was just like one row, of shelves. But I found Hitchcock Truffaut and also John Baxter's Science Fiction in the Cinema. Those were the first two books that I bought about film. And obviously, I absorbed them, and also there was Castle of Frankenstein magazine, which was an intellectual step or two up from Famous Monsters of Filmland, and they covered things like Orson Welles and Max O'Fools and all sorts of a whole broad range of actors, or not actors but directors.
Ted and I were talking about this a second ago. How I think you guys had to deal with it a lot more. With each generation had much more availability to a good library of film. But there's this aspect where sometimes, especially in your teen years, and you're becoming a film person, you read more about stuff than you actually see it, and you imagine these movies in your head.
Yes, I mean, and back then, you were limited to what was playing in theaters and what was playing on television. And there were really only 3 television channels at the time. And then around 1969, independent channels came in, and there was public television suddenly. And with public television, that suddenly gave one access to foreign films. There was a weekly program. I forget. I'm not remembering the name of the critic that hosted the show right now, but there was one, and then there was another late night show which focused just on silent films, which was called The Toy That Grew Up. And they wouldn't show complete films usually; they would show short films, but they would focus on a theme. So I learned a lot from that. So I would circle things in TV Guide and make sure that I watched them. And Castle of Frankenstein had a feature called the TV Movie Guide, where they reviewed things just as thumbnails. And so that was something that I would reread the magazine so much that I would remember the names of movies that had an especially favorable review, and I would make a point of tuning in to anything that seemed interesting.
I mean, and that was I think, wasn't Dante writing for them at the time?
Yes, he did.
And your first exposure to Bava, I think, is in Castle of Frankenstein, wasn't it?
It was. Yeah. It was, because for some reason my neighborhood theater never got Mario Bava movies. I wasn't aware of him at all, except through the occasional photo from Black Sabbath or something in Famous Monsters. But then Joe began to cover his movies, and he would also refer to Bava, as an adjective in reviews of other films. Like he would refer to, I remember he reviewed Whirlpool, the Jose Larraz film, and he said there were flashes of Bava-like brilliance. And I thought, oh, well, then I have to see this, and didn't get the chance until much later. In fact, I never saw Whirlpool in its entirety until I did the audio commentary for the Blu-ray.
Wow. Going back to when you bought the books, when you said you were buying some books, I've always been trying to figure out why I'm such a film obsessive that I am, and I think a lot of it is because of my dad's influence. But did something specific go, I want to buy this book to read about it, or it was just a natural evolution for you? You can't really pinpoint it.
Well, obviously there were pictures. They were actual. So it seemed to belong to me in the same collection as my Monster magazine collection.
Oh, okay, I got you. Right.
So I picked them up for that, but also in reading about them, I realized that these movies had a greater dimension because they would actually relate connections between one or more movies. Things like that. There was a chapter in Science Fiction on the Cinema that was all about the films of Jack Arnold. And so that gave me a way of seeing that, oh, this is like a whole family of films with the same point of view, the same directorial point of view. And I remember that I always I'd learned to observe just from watching movies that the director's name was always the last name on the screen before there was a fade down and then a fade in to the story that you were about to be told. And it was always like being introduced to the storyteller. So I had a sort of innate sense of what a director did before I actually learned what they did by reading. But there was one book in particular. It was Ivan Butler's Horror in the Cinema, which was in that same series of science fiction in the cinema. And his entire last chapter in the book was on Roman Polanski's Repulsion, which I hadn't seen, but I was so fascinated with the chapter and everything that it described as happening in the film, and giving it reasons for happening and for why it was there, and describing the way scenes were shot, that when the film finally came to late night television here, I watched it, and for the first time it was like I had already seen the film, and I had a way of looking into it deeper. And I think that essay in that book was like my skeleton key into what critical thinking about movies really was. And so then I began to apply that to everything that I saw and that interested me in some way. And it was always key to see these movies as many times as possible. I never had the idea that, just because I'd seen something once, I didn't have to see it again. It made it imperative that I see it more than once.
I had this experience this week where I went to Central Library, and I realized that a lot of the book, I went back to the film section. I don't go there that often, and I realized that it was almost like it directed my taste in some ways, some of the books that were up there, just because the books that were available. Same with like what was in the video store at the time. When did you you started, you wrote for your high school paper, but you started writing outside of high school at that point, right? While you're still in high school?
I did. When I was in my sophomore year of high school, I discovered Cinefantastique magazine in a bookstore, and a friend recommended that I try writing for them. And I was very drawn to it. It was the first slick, glossy magazine that I'd seen devoted to these films.
Did you just submit, or?
I did. I just, took my friend's advice and wrote a few reviews and sent them in. And oddly enough, what happened is that my friend died while we were still in school that second year. And the night that he died, I went to see a preview screening of A Clockwork Orange. And I was underage, and the movie affected me in a big way. I was just invited to go to this screening because I'd written for the paper. And so I was told that my friend died before I went to the movie. But there was some doubt about it. My mother said she was going to try and find out more about it and that she would tell me when I got back. So through the whole experience of seeing A Clockwork Orange for the first time, I was wondering, is he alive or is he dead? And then I got home and found out, and it was obviously a huge thing for me. It was the first death of a personal friend, and I didn't go back to school for 2 weeks. I was out of school. I just couldn't see going back. And it was during that period that I wrote this review. I took A Clockwork Orange as the subject of my first review, and I sent along with it shorter reviews. There was one of Godzilla versus the Smog Monster, and then one of a movie called it's now called Tower of Evil, but back then it was called, what was it? Something on Horror on Snape Island. That's what it was called.
Did you mention the friend in the review of Clockwork Orange?
No.
I use this anecdote a lot, but it's not my anecdote. Louis C.K. always uses this joke that he found out his daughter watched Clockwork Orange at a sleepover, and he's like, "Oh, so your childhood died last night." Like that I felt the same way when I first saw it, but coupled with that traumatic of it, that's astounding. Wow. I'm sorry. Wow.
It was a powerful thing, and over the course of the following, I would say 2 to 3 years, I remember counting the number of times I had seen A Clockwork Orange, and I stopped counting at 14. I don't know how many times I've seen it now, but I don't know that if it was the circumstances of when I first saw it, but there was something about it that I really wanted to deconstruct in my head and make sense of. And I read the novel, and I subsequently became a huge admirer of the works of Anthony Burgess. I mean, I've read virtually everything that he ever published. He was quite a prolific novelist. And toward the end of his life, I got to correspond with him briefly.
Wow.
What?
I have your one of your first. Was it you had a Burgess essay in the Purdue Fiction?
That's right. Yeah. They were putting in those days when I was trying to become a novelist. I read university publications that focused on fiction and interviews with writers and so forth. I remember there was one called Salmagundi. There was the Modern Fiction Studies from Purdue University, and the Kenyon Review, things like that, and Paris Review, obviously. But they had announced at Modern Fiction Studies that they were going to devote an entire issue to Anthony Burgess. And at that time, I had just about finished my reading of everything that he'd published up to that point. And it was all sort of in my head as this continuum. It was the only time in my life I just read him for like months. It may have even been for a full year. So I wrote to them and I said, I would really like to participate in your thing. What is your deadline? And then I asked them if they could possibly extend their deadline by a week because, it was coming together. I'd never tried to write anything like this before, and they allowed me. And they were very pleased when it came in. And it turned out that I was the editor of the magazine told me that I was the only contributor to that issue who didn't have 3 PhDs. and when she sent me my letter of acceptance, she addressed it to Dr. Timothy Lucas. And, I didn't even graduate high school. I dropped out of high school. So I always think of that as my honorary doctorate.
Why'd you drop out?
Personal reasons that had to do with my mother and decisions and choices that she was making with her own life. It was basically impossible to continue there.
How old were you when you did the Anthony Burgess essay?
I think I was in my early 20s.
Early 20s.
I'm not sure what the year was, but I might have been 22.
I want to rewind a little bit and. Maybe I was trying to explain to Shane, because like I said, the age differences here. I was trying to say, if you were a true film obsessive at the time, Cinefantastique was one of the magazines you had to read, had to buy, as opposed to Starlog was more like, okay, that's a mainstream mag for the ones that don't want to go deeper. I mean, is that how you saw Cinefantastique? That's how I saw it.
Well, I didn't really even read Starlog because it struck me as a sort of entertainment this week of science fiction. It wasn't anything that was addressed to critical thinking or having a deeper appreciation of films that had come earlier. But it was great because they did have their short reviews, but they were always so well written and so concise that they were able to convey a lot of thought about something, but just distilled down to its essence.
What kind of? Sorry.
I was just going to say that they also gave us little postcards where we could just write down our immediate thoughts after seeing something and drop it in the mailbox. And then they would put together their short notices from these cards. I still have a bunch of them that I Xeroxed before sending out, and some were never published.
What kind of books were you reading in high school? Fiction.
Not very many. I mean, I always collected books, which is an odd thing, but I didn't read anything but nonfiction. I remember having some of the Sax Rohmer Fu Manchu books and Conan Doyle Sherlock Holmes stories and things like this. My mother loved to go to thrift stores, and she would always send me off to the book department while she was rummaging through old clothes and things. And I would always bring something home from the thrift stores, and I remember I had a visiting uncle one day, and he called out to my mother. He was looking at my bookcase, and he says, "This kid's got good taste." And nobody had ever said that about me before, and it was actually such a personal thing that I took great pride in that. It's like, he was the first adult that took care to notice something about me like that, and he gave me his sign of approval. It was a very personal thing because it's not something I told my teachers about or anything like that. I was a bad student.
I remember having, I had a moment like that with my stepmom where for Christmas I asked for CDs of Bitches Brew and Soft Bolton by Flaming Lips. And she told me that she went to the clerk to ask for them, and the clerk said I had good taste. I remember I remember that adult validation was somehow important to me.
Yeah.
When did so what were the first after high school? What kind of writings were you doing on film after that?
I stayed with Cinefantastique. I wasn't very adventurous about trying other publications, except for local entertainment papers. I mean, at the time I left home, there was about a year there where I had to sort of find my feet and where I was going to stay. And I ended up staying in this apartment with other people who were working on a local entertainment paper that was called the Queen's Jester. And I became the film editor of that paper and worked on that for a couple of years. Then that was followed by another local entertainment paper that came along after the Jester ceased publication that was called the Rivertown Times. I was very briefly the film editor of Cincinnati Magazine, which is like the local Chamber of Commerce publication. It's still going on. I didn't stay with them very long because they asked me not to be critical. I didn't see the point of writing reviews of a film if you could not be critical. But they basically just wanted me to give a synopsis of everything and leave it at that. And I told them that was not what I did. So I shot myself in the foot there in terms of getting a nice paycheck every month.
When did VHS reviews start coming in?
That came about when I was a friend of mine here locally, a guy named Steve Spat, told me he used to get a magazine that was for video insiders because he worked in a department store where he was selling records and videotapes and things. So he got this magazine, and it led me to a place in Chicago, a magazine called Video Movies. I think it was Video. It became Video Times, but it was also known as Video Movies, I think, first. And they would send me VHS tapes, even beta tapes, I think, at the beginning, and I would review things for them. And it was while I was doing the work there that Video Watchdog was conceived, because I started noticing differences in there were different versions of the same movie. I would find out, and even movies that were pan and scan might be pan and scanned a different way between two different releases. So I wanted to point these things out, and everybody else on the magazine that was reviewing films on video were just reviewing the movies. They didn't make any personal remarks about the presentation. And I convinced my editor that this was the whole reason behind reviewing a movie on home video. You could find the review of the movie anywhere, but this was specifically about video. You had to talk about the presentation somehow.
It started out just with pan and scan. It wasn't you. I mean, transfers weren't obviously going to be a thing. Were you doing audio, checking things like that, or?
It was a little primitive at the time to be writing about audio with any authority, but I would compare dubbed and subtitled versions of movies. Differences in panning and scanning. I remember we started out with two versions of Hercules with Steve Reeves because I had seen it on television, and then I saw the home video version the following week, and so the previous one was fresh in my mind, and I had also taped it off of the air. So I realized comparing the two that they not only had different opening credit sequences, but they were dubbed in English differently. And that's because when the original release from the 1950s was re-released in the early 70s, they shortened it so that it could be a double bill with Hercules Unchained, the sequel. And to make the two movies shorter, they cut stuff out of them and they redubbed them from scratch.
Tim, when you started doing these kind of reviews, did you sense that you were the only one doing this, or was anybody else out there doing it, your peers, or were you basically the pioneer in this somewhat? Yeah.
I was doing it all on my own. I mean, I didn't have anybody that I was referring to as a point of reference, but there's also Douglas Pratt, who was doing his Laserdisc newsletter.
Oh yeah. Right.
And I understand that he was doing it around the same time, but I think he came after I did. Either way, we were working on this independently, and together we started this kind of criticism.
Well, on a personal note, I just remember I came across Video Times at Reed Wars here in Evansville, and I just remember there was something different. I mean, I was reading you before I knew this. I was reading Tim Lucas before I knew it was Tim Lucas, and there was something going on in this magazine that really, really liked it. And then, of course, those paperback books came out that Video Times put out, and that was I mean, how soon did you have a VHS machine? Were you one of the first ones in the market? Did you go crazy once that came out, or?
Well, sort of. I mean, I actually I was collecting the tapes before I had a player of my own.
I was too.
I remember that I had my friend Steve Spat, as I mentioned before, he lived down the street from me. And the night that John Lydon and Keith Levine from Public Image Limited were on the Tomorrow Show with Tom Snyder, he recorded it. And so I said, oh, well, you've got to give me a tape of that. And so I had things like that. And there was also a recording of The Adventures of Hercules, which was a feature film distillation of a Italian TV miniseries based on the Odyssey. It had Mario Bava special effects in it, and it ran on the CBS late movie once. And so I had a friend in Los Angeles who recorded that and sent me a copy of that. So I remember having this little shelf of 6 or 7 tapes before I had my own machine. And then once I got my own machine, all bets were off, and the collection quickly accumulated.
Were you just going to other people's houses to watch these or to rewatch them? Or?
Sure. Yeah. And I mean, they would also take things out of the store. And so I got to see movies like Halloween, for the first time on their television sets.
That doesn't sound like a movie that goes well with pan and scan.
No.
Video Watchdog, did that start as a column, or was that a separate magazine when it started?
It was a column. In fact, the editors took a little. They did a spoof on the RCA Victor Nipper character who's listening to the phonograph, the dog that's listening to the phonograph, and they put a little dog in front of a television set and called it Tipper. So they were referring to me as Tipper, the video watchdog. And I think this coincided with Tipper Gore, who was the wife of Al Gore, the senator at that time. And she had a campaign going to sanitize rock and roll music.
The chip and stuff.
Right. I remember Frank Zappa going in before Congress and giving a long talk.
That's a cool testimony. I've watched it on YouTube, and friends have recommended watching it there.
Yeah. So I think that by naming the video watchdog Tipper for this little cartoon was just a sort of joke at Tipper Gore's expense. But when Video Movies or Video Times went under, I wanted to continue the thing in other forms. And so I briefly did it for a thing called Overview. That was a video magazine on videotape that Michael Nesmith produced in Los Angeles. And it was only sent out to, I think, 6 different markets around the country where there was a lot of video penetration. Philadelphia was one of them, I know, New York, Los Angeles. And the magazine had a lot of interesting contributors to it. Comedians, they would have dance performances and music videos and things like that. But it was just ahead of its time. It didn't make its money back. And the idea is that if you get tired of what this is, you can always use the tape. You can tape over it, with whatever you want. But, it should have been great. And I did a little 5-minute segment as the video Watchdog, which you can see on YouTube, I think, or at least the Video Watchdog site may still have it up. I'm not sure. But that happened. And then when that didn't move forward, I offered Fangoria the column, and they couldn't accept it for Fangoria, but they said they were starting their own competition in the form of a magazine called Gore Zone, and they invited me to do it there. And so I was with Gore Zone for like the first 23 issues, I believe.
Back to the video, were you guys? Was it just you guys were speaking an essay and you had clips along with it, or are you guys trying to do anything? I mean, it sounds like there's room to do something kind of interesting or innovative with that.
Well, overview, you mean?
Yeah.
Right. Yeah, that was, it was a weird experience because it was my first trip to Los Angeles. And what they did, I told them basically what I wanted to cover, what I thought we could cover. And they basically took me to the office and they sat me down at a table in front of a typewriter and said, write your script. We're recording this tomorrow. And I don't know why they didn't let me write it at home and then submit it to them where I would have been more comfortable. But I had to write this on a strange typewriter in a strange room with people walking around me. So what I picked out were basically things. There was a video version of The Wizard of Oz on the market at that time that left out an important line of dialogue for some reason, just a piece of the scene where the wizard is passing out gifts to the various characters. There's an important line of dialogue missing in that. It was released on a label called Video for Kids, and a piece of it was just missing. So I pointed that out. I pointed out the awful colorization that had been done on The Absent-Minded Professor, where the tires on the Model T Ford were the same blue as Fred McMurray's hair. And what else was there? I had been given a tape of The Fly, the original version of The Fly in its original widescreen dimensions. This is extremely rare at the time. But David Cronenberg had gotten it from Martin Scorsese, and David gave it to me. So I was actually able to show people a shot from The Fly as it should have looked for the first time on video in widescreen, and then compared it to the pan and scan version just to show people what they were missing in the translation.
I do want to ask about Videodrome. So you were you were assigned to write about it, and then that role just kind of grew?
Assigned to write about Videodrome?
Yeah.
Yeah. What happened was oddly enough, I remember that I was writing a lot about Oliver Stone because I had sort of, I don't want to say discovered him, but I was the first person to approach him and interview him for a publication for his movie Seizure. This is 1974. His directorial debut. And I did this for Cinefantastique, and we spent a lot of time on it. I remember Oliver sent me a whole shoebox full of cassettes where he would just answer questions of mine at length. And I wish that I had kept them, but tape was a rare commodity in those
man, you could have
4 days.
That would have been
they all got recycled. It's a real shame because they were hilarious. But anyway, I transcribed the tapes, what was most important from them, and wrote my article from that. But they weren't able to use it because they couldn't get the material to illustrate the feature. So it never ran until I finally ran the interview in Video Watchdog. I think it was number 27. So anyway, because of the Oliver Stone connection, I was doing a lot of preliminary stories for Cinefantastique on Conan the Barbarian as it was coming together. And at the same time, another writer named Paul M. Salmon was writing about Cronenberg for Cinefantastique. And there was a point when we actually crossed, and Paul started doing all of the writing about Conan the Barbarian, and I started writing about Cronenberg. We just traded roles. And he ended up going to Spain and becoming an active member of the film industry. And I'm still here in Ohio.
Salmon was the guy that wrote the Blade Runner book.
That's right. Yeah. And he's also written a big book on Tarzan, which is really great. And he wrote a book about Christmas movies. He's done a lot of writing about film. But anyway, yeah, I got invited up to do an on-set report of Videodrome, and I was the only critic allowed to visit the set. And what I didn't know until I got there was that David really hadn't told anyone on the publicity end or the production end of the film that I was coming up. He was just sort of sneaking me onto the set. And my first day on the set, it looked like I was going to get thrown out, but he went to bat for me and convinced them to let me stay on, under the understanding that I would not reveal, anything about the story in my reports.
I'm guessing that was a relationship that stayed true through the years. Are you guys still friends, or?
No, we haven't spoken in about 30 years. We had I think for a relationship between a journalist and his subject, I mean, I had a really strong view of what I could do. I really wanted to be someone who could sort of take what I knew or what I felt about his movies and kind of spread the gospel, and sort of define what a Cronenbergian film was. That wasn't being done so much at the time. And I really saw him as an unusually literary filmmaker. In fact, one of the things that I liked most about him was that he consolidated or brought together a lot of my own literary enthusiasms that I never knew anyone else who would be like interested simultaneously in, say, Vladimir Nabokov and William S. Burroughs. They just were like polar opposites in literary circles. But he admired them both, and so we had that in common. And I remember the first time I interviewed him, I asked him if he had ever read Thomas Pynchon, because I saw some of Pynchon stuff, and he had read Pynchon, but he didn't particularly like Gravity's Rainbow, and we talked about that. So I really wanted to use my writing about him not just to report what was going on in his films or to plug them or anything, but I really wanted to stand up and explain in some sense what people's connection should be to these films and how they should look at them. And so he really did occupy me creatively through most of the 1980s. And, my own ambitions escalated as I was working with him. And, as will often happen, I wanted to write something original. And sometimes his projects seem to propose things like that. And they certainly encourage things like sequels to The Fly and whatnot. I wrote a sequel to a treatment for a sequel to The Fly that got overlooked for weird reasons, but some aspects of the treatment do turn up in the film that they made. And I also spent a year writing preliminary drafts of a script for Naked Lunch, which he gave me permission to do because he said he really wanted to get the ball rolling on that film, but he was obliged to keep working on Total Recall, which was a movie that got made, but without him. But
wasn't this originally supposed to have like Richard Dreyfuss in it when he was doing it?
Yes, he wanted Richard Dreyfuss for it. And I remember that his big problem with it is that the producer, I think Ron Chissette, really wanted this section or this plot twist in the movie where the hero had to complete his duties before his head exploded because there was something that had been injected into his neck. And I said, this is from Escape from New York. This is in the Carpenter film. And he said, yeah, it is. And I really don't like it either, but the producer insists that we keep it. And so they couldn't get past this hurdle. And I really don't remember if it's in the movie. It's been a long time since I've seen the movie. But anyway, that's why he left that. And then he went on to do Naked Lunch. And, as I well understood, he wanted the opportunity to write it himself. But he did call and he told me that he appreciated the work that I'd done and that I had been able to solve some problems that saved him time that would have taken time to solve if he had started from scratch. So I've got 2 drafts of my own that are sitting around. I just found one in the attic. I'm going to reread it and see how well I did.
How do you start thinking about adapting Naked Lunch? Like, what was the process of diving in on that?
Well, I had read, I'd been reading, I had known the book for probably 7 or 8 years at that point, and had read it a few times. And I knew that it was just a series of routines, that it wouldn't really hold together. And I knew that it was going to need that biographical element. And I had just read his book, Queer, which was an early draft of his novel Junkie, which was more biographical or autobiographical. And I thought, this is how you do it. You have these routines separated by scenes of him as in reality, as he really is, and you show how the reality influences the fantasy. And so a lot of the main things that happen, even in the version that David made, involve the real biography of William S. Burroughs. They don't really have anything to do with Naked Lunch per se. Things like the William Tell experiment, where he accidentally shot his wife to death, and so on.
That's probably my favorite part of the movie.
Yeah.
So, Tim, when you're this period with David, and you're doing drafts, I'm sure you're still doing what was Video Watchdog started by then, or you're still doing Cinefantastique back then? That's right.
No.
So, did you think that you were going to maybe become a screenwriter, or do you want to keep your hands in all kinds of different things, or did you want to?
No, I did. I thought I was going to become a screenwriter, and basically, what I learned is it's a dangerous place to stand between someone else and their ambition. And the way I was doing it like a guy here in Ohio. I wasn't doing it like a guy in Los Angeles. I wasn't doing it through an agent. And I wasn't doing it for any money. And as a result of the experience, I learned the hard way some very important lessons, which is never do anything without representation, never do anything free, because people value what they pay for. And it's a hard lesson to learn. And, it came rather late in my life because I was already, in my 30s. Doing this. This is something you should learn when you're in your teens.
When was the first novel? When did you start switching over to prose fiction?
Right. Well, I had always been writing some form of novel. I wrote my first one in 1975. It was kind of a novel in the sense that the chapters connected, but they were basically chapters documenting different nightmares that I had. So there was like a through line.
This is before Rick Veitch's his comic book. Remember the Rare Beat Teens? Is that called the
what?
The comic book that Rick Veitch did. He was documenting dreams and nightmares too.
Oh yeah,
comic book format. But that sounds like you were doing it before that.
Well, this was 1975, and it was called The Audience Becomes Flesh, which is a very Cronenbergian title, but it was before I'd ever seen a Cronenberg film. And in fact, when I got to the set of Videodrome, I remember looking through the script, sitting there on the stage, and I called him over and I said, "Look at this." And I said, because there was all this text about becoming flesh, and I thought, this is what I was doing in my own first writing. And I thought of that because I was just looking at the manuscript, what had piled up, and what is this about? And it was about me as an audience learning to become not so passive. And to take a more active, role, to sort of assert myself as a being of flesh and blood. But after that, I did another one called The Art of Conversation, which was a book of conversations with different imaginary people. I wrote a short novella called Translucent Skin. There was one called Win Paradise. There was another one called Cassie Effler. There was one called TV Heaven that I worked on for about 4 or 5 years. And I had a horrible experience with that because I put a lot of time on it, sent it to an editor at St. Martin's Press, which I'd seen on some PBS show was like publishing a lot of innovative fiction at the time. And I got back a wonderful letter from an editor there named Ashton Applewhite, who's gone on to become a published author in her own right. But she was very impressed with the book, and she was comparing me to Thomas Pynchon in some ways, which was extremely flattering. But she said she didn't see any causal relationships between some of the chapters. She didn't understand what the book was about. And so with that in mind, I went back and I spent the next year or two working on another draft. And I called her to tell her that it was coming in. And when I sent the book out, it came back a week later with a form rejection. So that frustrated me so much that I just stopped writing novels for about 5 or 6 years. And then I got back into it through the back door by writing comic scripts for Stephen Bissett's anthology, Taboo, where I started doing a series called Throat Sprockets.
Would this have been around the same time From Hell was being published?
It's 1988. No, so, I was doing the comics thing, and for some reason I had difficulty getting along with artists. We always had, like, personality clashes. And Steve Bissett finally said, Tim, maybe you should, also because my scripts were getting really long, and artists were frustrated about how long it was going to take to get their work in print. And so he said, have you thought about doing this as a traditional novel? And I thought, well, I've given up those dreams. And I think during that period when I stopped trying to be a novelist, I sort of found my own voice as a novelist. I wasn't writing like other writers. If you look back at the early stuff, you can see who I was reading at the time. Whether it was the one that I wrote when I was reading James Joyce is a real, it's a real nightmare.
Was this? Did you? I was just curious. The prose in the criticism. I mean, it seems like were these complementing each other? Were these distinct voices, you think, between your fiction and what you were writing about movies?
Well, what I was writing about in Throat Sprockets, I mean, it's on the surface, it's about, it could be a satire of, what advertising is, how advertising, takes advantage of you, seduces you, turns you into a different kind of person. But I also took care to make it the story of what happened to the movie-going experience over a period of decades. So it started out, in a former movie palace that had turned into a sort of seedy porn theater. And then from that, you go to the shoebox cinemas, then the cattle plexes, and so on, and watching things on television. And I also asked the question, what happens to movies when they don't address a broad spectrum of people in a theatrical experience, when that broadcast becomes so narrow and specific that you can actually begin to build things around individual fetishes. So yeah, in that sense, things that I was picking up from what I was watching were being expressed in the fiction. My discovering Jess Franco's movies were very important to the writing of Throat Sprockets. He and his wife Lena Romay are in the book in some respect as disguised as other characters.
What was Video Watchdog like in the 90s? I mean, was it a big success or?
Initially, I mean, I recently was doing some cleaning in the attic, and I found a box that was full of Xeroxes and tear sheets pertaining to our first couple of years of the magazine, and there was. I remember we used to go to the P.O. box, and it would be crammed full of correspondence. People ordering subscriptions, people sending us really dense letters full of information that they had acquired. In fact, there was a lot of correspondence from people that we couldn't print because it was just too long. So there was a huge response to it initially, and as it went over, as it continued through time, I think that there was always the sort of same core audience There would be some people that would drift away. There would be new people drifting in, depending on what we had on the cover. You know, the circulation could go slightly up or down. But I think we finally got to the point where I realized that we weren't selling enough on newsstands anymore to really care about what we put on the cover being a commercial thing. We could put anything we wanted there, and our numbers would stay consistent.
Well, I remember I'll never forget I had I would go to Nashville a lot for concerts and movies sometimes because Evansville wouldn't have something. And I go into Tower Books or Tower Records maybe even, and there's this little magazine, Video Watchdog, and I said, "What is this?" And it blew me away. I was like, "Wow, this!" I mean, it was so. And I was not one of those people that came and went. I stayed there with every issue because there was always something every single issue that you guys would throw in there. But what I loved about it too was that you would you put Kozlowski in there, you'd put Tati, Buster Keaton, and so you weren't so rigid like other magazines would be. That the parameters would bounce back and forth.
Kind of the high low.
Yeah. So.
Yeah.
I mean, and that's a question I have, Tim, and I don't know if we've ever talked about it before, but we probably have. But the acceptance of all the levels of film, low, high, middle brow, low brow. I mean, it seems like there's this group of film fans that the lines are totally blurred. There's no boundaries, and you come across other fans that are just as rabid as you are in cinema, but you start naming off certain names or certain things, and that you lose them, and then if you would show them something like show them a Bava or show them a Jess Franco, and they would look at this and say, well, this is like Ed Wood, this is a bad film, or this they don't see what you're seeing or how you see it. So how do you explain that phenomenon of that kind of perception of a Jess Franco? Because Franco's not he's not the easiest guy to jump into.
No, and you can jump in and if you, depending on the movie that you go to first, I mean, it completely color your feelings about him, against him. And in fact, when I first discovered Franco, I mean, I saw a lot of his worst movies.
So what kept you going back, you think?
What happened, why I went back was because I went to a local video store and noticed that there were a lot of his movies there in these big boxes from Wizard Video. And, I was looking at these things and I've always been particularly interested in European horror because it's just the most cultured form of horror. They have, interest in sculpture and painting. I mean, it's inculcated into all the filmmakers that make horror movies there. And so the culture becomes expressed in their work in ways you never see happen in American films, and even to lesser degrees in British films. But so I had all these big boxes, and they had like names like Jess Frank, or Jay Franco. It was like he was hiding behind a different name on everything. There was J.A. Laser, who I decided must be a mask for Jess Franco, and turned out to be more or less, because that was Virgin Among the Living Dead, which Franco directed most of, but Jean Rollin directed some additional zombie footage for that version. So it gave me a sense of movies not only as art and personal expression, but as a kind of commercial subterfuge. That people could hide behind different guises to say different things, or so that they didn't have to represent themselves, and you could tell from a pseudonym which movies were of particular importance to the director, as opposed to another pseudonym. It was all like a secret coded language. And also, you got to remember back in those days that it was a great time because people were actively trading tapes from weird sources. They would make friends overseas and would trade, different region videotapes and things that would come off remote television stations. And so it was like a big swapping thing. It was all it was very countercultural compared to what was very comparable to what was going on in the late 60s with like bootleg albums.
Would you say do you enjoy watching Franco films, or are you more, or it's more of an intellectual game with you, or I mean,
It all depends on the individual title. I mean, there are some that I just unabashedly admire, and there are some that are like one that I sort of unabashedly admire would be Eugenie Desaad. Some of these really small films that he made for almost no money, that he would actually make pictures made from money that he took from other projects, just the crumbs that he took from other projects, and then made a really small personal film in between. Venus and Furs was always one of my favorites, but now when I look at it, I see that it's a very compromised film because it was subjected to a lot of post-production work. It was given a different music track. And there's this one Italian version that was taped off of Italian television of a movie called Paroxysms, which seems to be the closest to Franco's original form of the film. And when you see it, it has a lot more to do with jazz music. It's not as padded up with footage from the Mardi Gras. And, it's more of a personal expression. So those films I really admire. There's some like his zombie movies that are really just trashy. He's just he made these movies toward a more popular release so that he could take a little money off to the side like Cassavetes and make the more personal projects on his own. But you have to immerse yourself in them to distinguish between them. He's many different kinds of filmmaker.
That was part one of the interview with Tim Lucas alongside guest co-host Ted Haycraft. Check in next week for part two. In the meantime, hope you all are staying healthy, watching some good movies, and I'll be here next week.